right, so we have a really simple Bible story today, and I want you to consider yourselves warned. It said that you should be really skeptical of people who prance around in their fancy liturgical clothes and those who say long prayers. Luckily, I got rid of my gown a few years ago, and I tend to pray rather short, so it must be a warning about other people. But, okay, that wasn't in my text. Okay, at first blush, this is one of those biblical stories that looks like it's just a simple read and you can be on with it, just a really simple interpretation. One of those great moralistic biblical stories. Be more like the widow who gave her 2 cents than the rich guys who just gave a bit of what they had. Right, so I could go away now if it was that simple. And I'll tell you, it has been used on many occasions with just that message. Has been used on stewardship Sundays to say to people, pay up, give your all to the church, give everything you have. And I will not argue with you if you want to take that interpretation. I cannot argue the fact that stats show that generally speaking, the higher an income goes, the less proportion goes to charity. Can't argue the fact that indeed charitable givings, at least ones we can track on tax returns, have been slowly declining in Canada. But that's a lecture for another time. And I think that's really not the key point of this text that's before us. This is a story like so many that Jesus tells that you just need to look at a little differently to get the deeper meaning, which shouldn't be surprising to any one of us. If you have ever sat at the foot of Jesus on the edge of a hill, if you've ever jumped into a boat with him, if you've ever been led into the wilderness by him, if you've ever stood at the foot of a cross, you know that one thing is true. You can never be sure that things are as they first appear, especially when it comes to these stories of our faith. And so if the moral of this story is as straightforward as give, like the widow, it seems to me we'd be a little further ahead. We would have all taken that on and run with it. Jesus was always saying the kingdom of heaven is like. Well, it's pretty much always like not what you first assume, not what you know to be true. It's like looking out of the corner of your eye and gradually bringing into focus a new way of understanding the world. In fact, one thing that I love about Jesus is how he's not always so preachy. I mean, maybe sometimes preachy. But I love the stories, which is so many of them, that are just change your perspective a bit, see things a little differently. There is so much to learn from that. There's a story I haven't shared before that I just think is a good metaphor to consider what it means to look at the world from a peripheral point of view. And my dad had a pituitary tumor 25 years ago, which if you're going to get a tumor in your head, this is the one to get, they say, really easy to take care of. But what happened with my dad is after his surgeries, he was left without peripheral vision in his left eye. And I'm sure it's similar to many of you walking around with an invisible disability. But what, of course, it's meant for my dad is if he wants to see things to the left, which is where he tends to like to see things, if he wants to see things to the left, he's got to turn his head a bit more. And so I've asked him, it's been almost 25 years, and I've asked him recently, like, what's it like? Do you notice anymore? And he said that he actually doesn't miss anymore what he's missing. Like he just doesn't even try to get all of that into his vision. It's just adjusted with a smaller scale of vision. And I've wondered sometimes about this as a metaphor, like, wouldn't it be helpful if we didn't get bombarded with so much? If we didn't have to take in so much stimulus? I've wondered if our biological evolution can now and then get in the way of our spiritual evolution. It is, of course, well known that we are taking in so much stimulus in every single moment and needing to decide what we pay attention to. What is it that matters in this moment? And you think about it. If you're in a classroom, You're going to try to pay attention to the teacher more than the distracting kid beside you. If you come into church for the first time with a toddler on your hip, you're more likely to find out where the washroom is before you notice the books of remembrance. I won't tell anyone else. Lots of ages would notice the washroom first. Let's just be honest. We have to, moment by moment, decide what is important to look at. And that's why I think what Jesus often tries to do is say, just shift your perspective a little bit. And the truth is, left to our own devices, we tend to surround ourselves with others who see things the same way, who interpret things, who will value the same things. And so as Brad was reading that scripture and started out with this judgment of the scribes prancing around in their fancy clothes, it is helpful to name, this was not a condemnation of the entire Jewish faith. It was a condemnation, if you will, of those who were expressing it in a certain way. And an invitation to say, look at the widow. Because the fact is, no one would even notice the widow. Like, she would be like an extra on a Hollywood movie scene, on a busy New York scene. She would not be noticed, the lowest of the low in her society. And so by Jesus just saying, notice her, it's more a matter of bring her into your consciousness and perspective than anything else. It's just notice her. And when we do that, when we notice something that has been on the peripheral, especially in this case, we also step into a continual invitation to show up and be present. He says to them, pay attention to the things on the edges. Step back from the continual bombardment of things that seek our attention, and you're going to notice a couple of things. You're going to notice, and this is why I say it's not all about money, you're going to notice that that widow gave her last 2 cents to a corrupt institution. So, an argument could be made, give your last 2 cents to the church. I don't happen to think we're corrupt, but we've got a bit of a mixed history. The invitation is not so much to give your all to a corrupt institution, but keep in mind, this story happens 4 days before Jesus makes his way to the cross. Is he maybe saying, look at her giving her all to a corrupt institution, as I am about to give my all in the face of a corrupt empire? Is he saying it's actually about giving your all? And what does that look like for us? When she stepped out of the treasury that day with no money in her pocket, she was destitute. Like, she would not have expected that those monies would go to the outreach programs of the temple. She would have no expectation that her giving would come back to her, no transactional understanding of how things worked. And I wonder sometimes if that gets in our way, this idea that when we give, we receive. We give in a certain measure and expect to have something in return. What she gave that day was everything, almost like that idea, that truth of you come into this world with nothing and you leave with nothing. And so those who've studied this passage talk about it being giving up of everything so that her whole life might be reliant on God. Now, I'm not saying to give up and let God. I'm not saying that, what happens is when Jesus says, pay attention to that woman, then you start to see, if you hadn't noticed her, you wouldn't have seen, you wouldn't have been able to ask the questions about what's going on, what has led her to that poverty. What is it at work in her that allows her to give everything up? I'm curious about us today in this world, in this season, this post-Labor Day season, when for some reason we decide that we should just load busyness onto our lives after we've been all kind of relaxing all summer. This season, more than any, is a moment for us to say, wait a minute, stop. What does it look like to give my all? Because no one's going to give you that time. No one's going to make that time in your life but you. I don't know what possessed her to give up all that she had. And I don't know what happened after, except probably that her community didn't have her back. But what does it look like? Can we make a leap to our day and age, what it looks like to shift our perspective from what we know to be true and to be open to what's going on around us, what's going on in my world, in my life, in the world beyond me, that is calling for my deep attention? And what does it mean to rely on God when we act like functional atheists? Some of us act like real atheists. What does it look like when we act like functional atheists and say that we believe in God and don't trust in God? What do we need to do with that term God to make it make sense to us in today's world? Because if she is giving it all up so that some supernatural figure can drop down from heaven and pick up her pieces, she's going to be disappointed. But what does it look like to lean into a love that's great enough to birth the universe, that's great enough to accompany people through all sorts of trials and difficulties? What does it look like to trust in that presence? I want to invite you to two things in this season, and they're optional. Everything's optional here. Sometimes it's nicer if you go to a church where they tell you exactly what to do and believe, but here's your options for this week. In this season that for many of us is so demanding and busy, an invitation to take time for your practice, whatever your practice might be. You might, like me, want to sell your car, because I'll have to tell you, I have never walked so mindfully as I have in the past 2 weeks. What is your practice? What does your soul need so that you can be shifted, even if you don't know you need to be shifted, from what you know for sure to just a different angle? Commit to exploring what practice will open your heart, not to answers, not to truths, to love, to openness, to change, to awareness. And another invitation in this time. Another invitation to be gentle with yourself. And I know I might say that too often. Don't set the bar too high. Yes, I've said enough isn't enough, but I don't mean enough is enough, like a mother might say. I don't mean that you're not enough. I mean, what does it look like to be a people who dare to say we can give more? Look for the simple stories. Look for the simple places of light. I have been following the path of Hurricane Dorian in Nova Scotia, where all my family is. And one of the first stories I came across before it had even gone national on Twitter was this young fella who was heading back to university, just visiting Halifax, and his flight was canceled. So he chose to go to the market on Saturday morning and set things up and work with his Airbnb host. We can tell so many stories about how people don't do enough and don't care enough. What can you do this week that is a non-transactional way of showing up and giving your all to this world? A small kindness, a gesture of an open heart. And I promise you, you won't be able to do it, at least not as well, without the practice. Practice taking care of your spirit, opening to where God is at work in your life and the world, and see just how much you notice that love, yours and yours and yours and strangers, is coming together and making beautiful things happen in a world that would tell you there's only fear and anxiety. Give it a try. Trust it. We're about to sing a song that talks about every decision being hard to make. Get the screen down while I find my line. Every decision towards unity is a struggle. It's only a struggle when we allow it to be a struggle. Let's be people who dare to say there is love at work right here, right now in our lives, and we can share it. May it be so. Amen.
You can stay seated as we sing together.
Each other's ways, where love is lived and all is done with justice and with praise. Oh, for a world where goods are shared and misery truth is spoken, children spared, equality achieved. We welcome one world family and struggle with each choice that opens us to unity and gives our vision voice. The poor are rich, the weak are strong, the foolish ones are wise. Tell all who mourn, outcasts belong, who perishes will rise.
Tell all who mourn,
Tell all who mourn, outcasts belong, who perishes will rise.
Friends, for some of you, this is home.